What's up, everyone? I'm back in Iowa City. I no longer have that cool telescope behind me because that was my parents' telescope. But I do have a mirror, which is equally symbolic, I guess. And I'm back among my books, and I have my Kafka blanket here, which has half of the Metamorphosis printed on it, which was the story that basically got me into writing and taught me how to think like a writer, not to take things for granted, to not just accept the first description that comes to mind, to look at things from different perspectives, to keep searching for the truth, things like that. So today we're going to do things a little bit differently. We'll talk about the story first. Alexia Arthurs herself is an interesting character. She has this swaying way of talking to you, and her eyes either dance over you or look into the distance, and she has this wispy, ethereal tone that gives you the impression that she's been thinking her whole life about the thing that she's telling you right now, even if you just asked her the most unexpected question. And I don't really know her that well. I've just randomly talked to her here and there. So these are my fleeting and stylized impressions of her. But now that I read her story, I feel like I know her a lot better. And I think a lot of that has to do with character. Um, because there's something about writing that is like you sit down for months or years to try to describe to the reader this deep part of you that finds it difficult to communicate in an everyday way. I mean, it's a part of me that's not even communicating right now, even no matter how much I talk about writing. And it's a deep part of you that takes a really long time to emerge. And since what you're doing is describing your unique and unspeakably complex experience of being human, characters, the humans in your story, are really important. Now, if you want to work on characterization, all you have to do is write a story in first person. In first person, every single sentence of the narration is a reflection of your main character. Even a seemingly objective description, like saying that the sky was pink, well, it's not really objective. The fact that the narrator took the time to single out that one particular description has to reflect them in some way and the circumstances that they're in. So, right from the opening sentence of Mashup Love, we get character. The narrator's mother has an opinion, right? Sinful things happen before light comes back in the sky. And it's not just that opinion, but it's the way she says it. I mean, she could have said, sinful things happen before day breaks, or sinful things happen before the sun returns, or before the sun comes up. Um, or before the sun jumps out of the horizon. She could have said any number of things, but she says it in the particular way, before light comes back in the sky. And the narrator has a different opinion. We know this because the narrator says that's how ignorant, how country she was. So we already have a couple of different gradients that are being set up, right? We have city, countryside. We have knowledge, ignorance. We have sin or night versus light. So naturally, some questions appear in our heads, like who is going to be right? Is something bad going to happen? Um, these kinds of questions are part of what give the opening story its thrust and its momentum, and the reason why the reader will be willing to be patient in order to find out like the answer to these questions, and especially the answers to characterological questions. Because part of the pleasure of reading is to experience life from somebody else's perspective and to see the secret things um, that maybe they don't that people don't normally tell you, right? We'll talk more about that later, but um, so the narrator tells us about himself, right? He says, not only am I quiet, I am also simple. Everything about me is quiet and simple, from the clothes I put on to the ordinary way that I talk that doesn't bring attention for being an educated man, to the unfussy way uh, I gratefully eat everything that Anne Marie puts in front of me. All of this might be true, of course, but of course, we also know that there is such a thing as an unreliable narrator. So, behind this seemingly simple description of himself, what we actually learn are the things that he values. So he values being simple and quiet. He values being unfussy. I would also argue that he's not really that simple because emotionally he's very complex. You can have a lot of simple language, a lot of simple action in the story. One thing that's hard to get away with character is to have characters that have simple emotions, um, or very simple observations about the world, because that's not typically the way that we experience the world. I would argue, at least not when we're experiencing the most intense and important moments of our lives, or the things that we keep thinking about. And what about his brother? The narrator says he is the kind of man who displays importance while talking foolishness. So, okay, maybe this is true, but also this tells us what the narrator thinks of his brother. Esau finds it contemptible that his brother behaves this way. We can call this two-way characterization. Um, Here are some other things that he says about his brother. He was laughing, his whole body bent over, laughing like a man who doesn't have one fret in the world. I always thought of him as having less shame than I have. The last time I saw him, he was in the middle of chasing a woman. So those are some other things he says about his brother. The more we get to know the narrator, the less we think that these are neutral statements, and the more we begin to understand the tone behind these statements. In some sense, there is no such thing as a neutral statement in the first person. He also tells us, people respected me, but they preferred him. Right? So he doesn't have to explain here. He doesn't have to tell us that he's jealous. We're starting to get to know the rivalry, the sort of frenemy or situation that they have going on. He says, all my life I waited for Mama to have a stronger reaction to the many ways my brother shamed himself and our family, but she always just shook her head, her expression becoming more pained with the severity of my brother's actions. So that last line tells us a lot about why this story is being told. This story is being told after the mother's death, and their mother's opinion of them was obviously very important to Esau. So on the one hand, from the very opening, he tells us that she's country, and he disses her a bit, basically. But on the other hand, he deeply wants her approval. He wants her to have a positive opinion of him. And the fact that she never gave him that opinion is a source of suffering for him. So sometimes contradictions are actually what make the strongest characters, because it makes them feel multifaceted, because we're full of contradictions ourselves. And if you can't see your contradictions, maybe you should start paying attention to that. Okay, so now for the extra stuff. There are 4 basic vehicles for characterization. 1, appearance. Some people would say, well, but your appearance doesn't say anything about you. Well, the way you present yourself does say something about you. Your goth face says something about you. If you're rich but you wear muddy sneakers, that says something about you. Okay, number 2, actions. That's understandable. Then we have dialogue, and 4th, we have thoughts. And so, obviously, actions and dialogue are full of, miscommunications, and full of, they're very layered. And then thoughts are really close to the way that the character sees the world, and these different layers are going to be important. Let's talk about Hamlet, right? So Shakespeare based his famous play on the Scandinavian legend of Amlet. And the original story, Amleth, is much in the same position that Hamlet is in, except that in the original, there is also a prophecy that Amleth might kill the uncle, and the uncle is suspicious of Amleth and sets various tests for him. So the original Amleth pretends to be insane so that he is not perceived as a threat. But in Hamlet, Shakespeare's play, there is no prophecy. The uncle is not immediately mistrusting because the murder is more or less a secret, which makes Hamlet's decision to act insane more mysterious. It's not immediately clear why he does it. And you might say, well, that means that we don't know him very well, right? So that's bad characterization, right? But actually, in a way, good characterization is not so much about having all the answers about a person, but being able to ask deeper and deeper questions as the story progresses about that person. For example, in Hamlet, our hero is not forced to act crazy by external circumstances. He chooses to act crazy. In fact, him choosing to act crazy is what sets off the warning signals for Claudius. So, why does he take that upon himself? Is it a cunning strategy to begin planning his revenge, or is he trying to rid himself of the burden of revenge, which is more or less expected of him? Are these options mutually exclusive, etc.? And you can continue to, wade through and try to cut through the layers of his persona. We can divide a character into four different layers of persona. We have the public persona, how you interact with strangers or acquaintances, the way that Hamlet interacts with his uncle Claudius, or the way that I described Alexia Arthur's. I only know her public impression, or your impression of me, and your different thoughts about me. That's your public impression. Then there's the private persona, how you act with your partners or close friends, like the way that Hamlet acts with Ophelia. There's a personal persona, the things that you keep to yourself, like the monologues of Hamlet. And then there's an unknown persona, the things that you don't even know about yourself, which would be like Hamlet's subconscious. And all of these things are at play in trying to create vivid characters and trying to help us, recreate on the page a real complex consciousness that feels alive, that is mobile, and that can really impress us and feel like you're talking to a real human being. Like when you start writing a story as a writer, the character feels like a child. Like they have a lot of needs. You have to give them clothes. You have to give them food. You have to help them. Do all kinds of things. But then your character starts to grow, and the more you write, the more it feels like eventually the character gets older and older, and they start to feel like a friend. And at a certain point, the character might even know more about you um, than you know about yourself. They might know more about themselves than you know about them. And each time you sit down to write, it's like you're encountering this long lost friend that you just can't get enough of, and you're sad to let them go when you have to call it quits for the night. So yeah, it's great to be able to discover character while you write. um, that's part of the fun of it. So I guess my advice, just like plot, would be to not plan about it, not plan it too much or think about it too much, and just try to give your characters interesting decisions to make and discover the character while you're trying to embody the character. Yeah, so talk to y'all next time.